Hi, I'm Scott Dust. I'm the Chief Research Officer at Cloverleaf, and I'm also a management professor at the Farmer School of Business, Miami University. And today we're going to talk about what makes Cloverleaf unique in terms of their technology platform. And to do so, we're going to bring in a social science perspective and talk about cognitive processing. So first off, what exactly is team building? Well, it's any type of intervention that focuses on improving those relationships between the team members, and that could be clarifying roles, what could they be doing, should they be doing, or overcoming some type of obstacle, which might be task-oriented or it might be more interpersonal and relationship-oriented, with the goal of increasing team functioning or improving team functioning. And that could be efficiency, performance, productivity, or maybe even something more specific like innovativeness or voice behaviors. So within team building, historically, the focus of differentiation has been on one of two things. It's been content or the delivery process. So content typically comes in the form of assessments where individuals are scored on an assortment of dimensions, and that helps them understand their tendencies or behaviors of themselves as well as their team members to try and figure out what to do differently. The delivery process focus is more about how that content is actually used. So for example, the differentiation might be in the approach of using one-on-one executive coaching, or it might entail a group experiential exercise where then the team members debate and discuss what happened and try to learn from those scenarios after the exercise is completed. So what Cloverleaf is doing different is that they offer a technology platform where this content is actually delivered and this delivery process unfolds. And this is important because, as we'll soon discuss, the platform approach to team building helps overcome some of the limitations of the approaches in the past, and it also creates some new opportunities to improve the way that we're managing human capital. So first, let's talk about some of those limitations of those past approaches. When team building initiatives take place, it's a one-time experience. The individuals take assessments in advance, and then they're given scores and reports, and then they show up for a one-day workshop or a weekend retreat. And this one and done approach doesn't work because growth and development, as we know, takes time and it takes continuous support for it really to be effective. The second problem is information overload. And when team building participants receive a data dump, they just spend a lot of time trying to figure out what all of these dimensions mean, how to internalize the information, and what they should be doing is actually trying to understand how to implement and understand the implications of that information. Another problem is that the information they receive a lot of times is random or it is narrow. So it's random in the sense that the selection of the content and or the delivery process is whatever the organizational context that is rolling this out feels most comfortable with or has done in the past. It also ends up being one assessment at a time, which may not be applicable to everybody within the organization. Different people need different things. Some people might need to learn more about their roles. Some people might need to learn more about their thinking styles. So it ends up being very narrow. Another challenge is that these approaches are context-free. The role of the assessments is purposefully to be generalizable to a variety of different situations and a variety of different people. And that's problematic because it doesn't give enough specific insight on what exactly to do with a specific relationship or within a specific team or within a specific organization. So it's not customized to the actual individual. And then you can break down this team building from a social science perspective and start to bring in what is called cognitive load theory, or this cognitive processing mentality. So first thing is that team building is simply a learning process, and you're trying to answer three questions through team building. Number one, who am I? Number two, who are they? And number three, how should I behave given who I am and who they are? And so how do we do this? Well, it starts with Psychology 101, where everyone learns about what's called information processing. And that is simply, how do we get from point A, where we first receive information, to point B, where it is in our long-term memory, so that we can use it and apply that information that we learned in the future. So over time, educational psychologists have used this information processing model to develop what's called cognitive load theory. And all that is an instructional design theory and approach that reflects the way that individuals process information. Basically saying, here's best practices for learning based upon what research would suggest about information processing. And this is really helpful because it helps illustrate why some of the approaches in the past aren't working. And it also helps illustrate why Cloverleaf's platform can be useful. So let's start breaking down this Psychology 101 information processing model. It all starts with stimuli, and that stimuli is then brought into what's called our sensory memory. And this is at one point in time where we have all of these different stimuli, and the challenge becomes we can only handle so much stimuli at one time. If it's too much and we can't handle it, then it's forgotten. For that information that we can latch onto in our sensory memory, it can then become part of our attention. And that attention is then housed in our working memory. And then think of the working memory as like your computer RAM for your brain. And so we can operate on one or two or a handful pieces of information or chunks of information that then we're grappling with, and then eventually we encode. But again, if we have too much operating within our working memory, it will inevitably be forgotten. And then ideally, if we really are paying attention to it and latching on and understanding what it means, it is then encoded into our long-term memory, which is where we want it because it has infinite capacity and it's going to be there forever. So a few other important aspects of cognitive load theory is that, well, number one, we can't have too much at the sensory stage or at the working memory stage. So you need bite-sized information and you need to do it over time. Another aspect is this longitudinal perspective, is that you can't do this all in one sitting. The one-time data dump doesn't work. Another aspect is constantly reinforcing information through some type of platform. So you have to be able to rehearse what's in your working memory so that eventually it can be encoded. It might not work the first time, it might not work the second time, but over time, the more people start to understand it, elaborate on it, they have a higher likelihood of eventually encoding it. In addition to that, to go from long-term memory back to working memory and then back to long-term memory, this encoding retrieving process can be helpful in that it helps create more precision within what is in your long-term memory. It helps it be more accurate and more usable. So you have to, again, have this more long-term perspective to enable yourself to actually practice what you've learned at the stimuli stage. So next, let's talk about what Cloverleaf's doing from a practical perspective to actually incorporate what we know about information processing and cognitive load theory. So first off, Cloverleaf's system is both push and pull. And we'll talk about the push approach here in a second, but this is where past approaches are lacking. There is no system to be able to pull information as needed. So for example, if an individual wants to know how to work with a specific individual, perhaps their supervisor, or better practices for managing conflict with a specific team member, or maybe having a better likelihood of contributing better to their team, given who they are and who their team members are. They can, on their own terms and on their own time schedule, go to the platform and pull that information as needed. In addition, this push approach is done in a way that recognizes the limitations of information processing. So number one, it's bite-sized information. It's given to information in smaller pieces that doesn't create this cognitive overload where information can't make it through the information processing stages of sensory memory and working memory, etc. As well, it's relationship specific. So instead of being not having any context, it is specific to an individual with another individual, whether it be a colleague or a supervisor, and it might also be specific to the individual within the group at large. So that relationship-specific aspect makes it more applicable, makes it easier to understand, interpret, and actually engage in some type of behavior change. As well, this push approach also uses an action-oriented mentality, where in assessments, traditionally, all they're doing is focusing on the characteristics and the behaviors and the tendencies within those assessments, but where they fall short is understanding what to do with it, having some really specific action-oriented behavior suggestions on what to do given those characteristics. That's built into the platform in Cloverleaf so that people understand how to use it better. Another part of the push approach, and it deserves its own bullet, is this idea of categories. So categories are important because they are, in psychology terms, the equivalent of schemas. And schemas are kind of like the shelves and the storage bins of your basement. There's no way to really organize all of that stuff that's down there and use and understand where that stuff is unless you have some type of organization for where it should go and where it might be. And so by having schemas, it is the equivalent of making sure that there is some holding container for all of these bits and pieces of information to go. And that ensures that when you need it, you can draw upon it more quickly. And this is a really important part of the cognitive load theory, in recognizing that as information flows through this process, when you have schemas in place at the sensory memory stage or the working memory stage or the long-term memory stage, it ensures that that information can move on to the next stage with a greater likelihood, as well as being retained once it gets to the long-term memory stage. So a few schemas or categories that Cloverleaf is using are, just for example, personality, strengths, and culture. They're all getting at workplace phenomenon, but from different directions. So personality is just your tendencies and behaviors across settings. Strengths is how to add the most value given your natural talents, and then culture might be your worldview or your norm preferences when you are in specific types of work environments. But then in addition to that, you can break it down, or the system is breaking it down into subcategories. So just within personality, for example, you have 16 types, which covers all of the different possible behavioral profiles to get a more comprehensive perspective. Then there's also DISC, which gets at your tendencies given the environmental circumstances that you find yourself in and your tendencies given those environmental circumstances. And then Enneagram, which is more of like your lens or worldview for how you interact with the environment that you find yourself. Another type of category that's used is this idea of the workplace scenario. How exactly might the information be applied? So how you communicate and interact with others, how do you manage conflict with others, how do you lead and influence others, and more. So when you have all these different layers of categories, which in turn are in cognitive processing lingo, schemas, it ensures that this information flows for the process more appropriately. In addition to that, this is a practical platform, and it's longitudinal. It doesn't assume that everything's going to happen at once. It's constantly feeding information over time as needed, given a specific relationship in bite-sized format that is actionable. It's also dynamic. It recognizes that information is not perfect, and that it allows users to rate the degree to which it's helpful or unhelpful, inaccurate or accurate. And so over time, the system can learn to ensure that it is perfecting itself as time goes on, instead of assuming in a static format that everything applies to everybody in all scenarios. So in addition, the social science evidence is really starting to align very well with what Cloverleaf is doing. So collectively, all of these features that we've discussed could be housed in two different social science trends that we're starting to see. The first is this idea of systematic thinking versus intuitive thinking. And ideally, you use the correct type of thinking given the circumstances that you're in. And so intuitive thinking is simply using heuristics. And these heuristics are overgeneralized ideas for what you should do in order to efficiently do whatever needs to be done to survive. Think of this as being appropriate in more fight or flight type scenarios. It enables us to think quickly, on the fly, and help us make sure that we're not wasting time in order to make sure we make forward progress. Arguably, though, in team building scenarios, we don't want intuitive thinking because that actually is going to lead to overgeneralizations and maybe even cognitive bias. What we want is systematic thinking, We want people to think through the nuances and the contexts of themselves, their relationships, the organization, the teams they're in, and then decide what's the appropriate way to behave. Cloverleaf has this built into this platform, this systematic thinking mentality and approach. Another social science trend is this idea of micro-interventions, or its more practical term, nudges. So interventions have been used in psychology forever, where we know that if we intervene in a certain way versus a control group, we can see that there's some type of reaction in behavior. The problem is it doesn't last very long. And what researchers in psychology are now beginning to illustrate is that if we want this intervention to last over a long period of time, it actually has to be in smaller bite-sized increments, and it has to be longitudinal. That is what ensures that we actually have continued behavior change, not just for that one intervention setting. And that's exactly what Cloverleaf's platform offers, are these micro interventions. So let's summarize the highlights of, again, the uniqueness of Cloverleaf's platform from a social science perspective. So number one, team building is simply a learning process. And to date, prior approaches are ignoring this research on information processing and what we know about cognitive load theory. And so Cloverleaf's platform overcomes these limitations in several ways. It's not only push, but it's also pull. So it's letting the informations get the information as needed on their own terms. And when it is push, it's bite-sized information so that it doesn't overwhelm users. It's also based on categories, or in psychology terms, schemas, which helps people properly process the information that they need. It's also context specific, so it's down to the dyad level, or it's down to the team level, so that people can understand how to actually behave given their circumstances or relationships with others. And then it's also actionable. It's giving people suggestions, and it's taking the guesswork out of what do I do with this information. It's also longitudinal, and understanding that information processing takes time and it's a long-term process. And it's also dynamic in that it can adjust and adapt to the user's needs as necessary. So again, I'm Scott Dust at Cloverleaf, and thank you for listening.